Hi, my name is Paul Onsakia. Welcome to this training on risk-based approach, focusing on common themes for banks and trust and corporate service providers, TCSPs. This training session will provide you with key insights and common weaknesses of a risk-based approach, which will help you in designing, implementing, and reviewing a risk-based approach. We will start the session by discussing the rationale for a risk-based approach. Then we will discuss the elements of a risk-based approach, after which we will discuss the thematic deficiencies in a risk-based approach, mainly on risk assessment and monitoring. Then we conclude the session by discussing the best practices and references. Let's discuss the rationale for a risk-based approach. First, adoption of a risk-based approach is required by the Anti-Money Laundering Regulations 2018 revision. This is specifically in Part 3 of the MLRs. Additional guidance on the adoption of a risk-based approach is also contained in Section 3 of Part 2 of the Guidance Notes on the Prevention and Detection of Money Laundering and Terrorism Financing. Both the AMLRs and the AML Guidance Notes are available on the authority's website. Another rationale for a risk-based approach is that adoption of a risk-based approach is fundamental for an effective AML CFT and PF program in three key ways. First, it enables banks and TCSPs to adopt tailored measures commensurate with the risk. This means higher risks will face more stringent measures compared to lower risks. Adoption of a risk-based approach is also fundamental for an effective AML CFT program by providing an effective way to implement the FATF standards and essential for compliance with the international best practices. In June 2019, the FATF issued 4 different sector-specific risk-based approach guidance. One of the sectors was TCSPs. The risk-based approach for the banking sector was issued in October 2014. These guidance are publicly available on the FATF website. We will be making reference to this FATF risk-based approach guidance in the course of this session. Another rationale for a risk-based approach is that it leads to effective and efficient utilization of resources. This is so because risk-based approach allows banks and TCSPs to adopt tailored measures as previously discussed. Resources here mean time, staff, and money. Now that we have discussed the rationale for a risk-based approach, let's discuss the elements of a risk-based approach. There are 4 key elements of a risk-based approach. The first one is identification and assessment. The second one is management and mitigation. The third one is ongoing monitoring. And the fourth element is documentation. We will briefly discuss each of these elements. The first element on risk identification and assessment relates to identification of AML, CFT, and PF risks based on 4 principal factors. That is, customers, product and services, delivery channels, and geography. In this session, we will be referring to these 4 factors as the pillars of risk assessment. We will make reference to these factors in the course of the session. The second element of a risk-based approach is management and mitigation. This requires banks to identify and apply measures to mitigate the risks identified in the first step. Some of the management and mitigation measures include targeted training, appropriate customer due diligence procedures, including enhanced due diligence procedures, and periodic review of business relationship with the customers. The third element of risk-based approach is ongoing monitoring, which requires banks and TCSPs to implement policies, procedures, and IT systems to monitor changes in AML CFT risks. This is so to ensure that the risk-based approach remains relevant. The last element of risk-based approach pertains to the documentation of the risk-based approach, including documentation on the first three elements of a risk-based approach. Now that we have discussed the elements of a risk-based approach, let's discuss the thematic deficiencies on risk assessment. The first common deficiency is failure by the banks and TCSPs to consider and incorporate the results of the National Risk Assessment. The AML rules, the AML guidance notes, and the FATF standards are consistent on this matter, that banks and TCSPs should ensure that they consider the results of a National Risk Assessment in their own risk assessment. For instance, in the Cayman Islands National Risk Assessment conducted in 2015, dealers of precious metals and stones were considered to be medium risk. We have noted instances where banks and TCSPs have onboarded similar customers who have been risk-rated as low risk, without adequate documentation on why such customers are considered low risk. It was determined that this was as a result of a failure to consider the results of the National Risk Assessment, including the factors considered in the National Risk Assessment. Another common deficiency is a lack of adequate documentation to support the risk assessment methodology. For instance, we see cases where a customer is risk-rated medium, but the bank or the TCSP is unable to provide adequate support on how the risk rating was determined. Banks and TCSPs should ensure that the risk rating methodology is supported by adequate documentation. Another common deficiency in risk assessment is failure to ensure the customer risk assessment is current and adequately documented. The AML rules, the AML guidance notes all require banks to ensure that the customer risk assessment is kept current. Another common deficiency is where banks and TCSPs classify all clients from equivalent jurisdictions as low risk without considering other relevant risk factors, such as the principal factors we discussed when discussing the elements of a risk-based approach. Whether a customer is from an equivalent jurisdiction should not be the only factor in assessing the client risk. Banks and TCSPs should ensure that they consider all relevant risk factors, such as the nature of business, products, and the delivery channels. Another common deficiency is a failure to adequately consider all relevant risk factors. The AML rules, the AML guidance notes, and the FATF guidance all require banks and TCSPs to ensure that all relevant risk factors are considered in risk assessment. Failure to consider all relevant risk factors may lead to inaccurate risk assessment. In the next slide, we are going to see an example where an entity failed to consider all risk factors. Another common deficiency is skewed parameters in risk assessment, which lead to underestimation or overestimation of risk. It should be noted that underestimation or overestimation of risk has negative impact on the risk-based approach and should be avoided. In the next slides, we are also going to see an example of a skewed risk assessment. In this example of failure to consider all relevant risk factors, we have an extract of a risk assessment matrix for a non-personal account. In this instance, we see for geography risk, the entity considered the country of incorporation as the sole factor in assessing the geography risk. Country of incorporation was assigned a score of 1, which meant low risk, and the overall score was 1. However, this risk matrix failed to consider the following key factors in assessing the geography risk: nationality and residence of the UBOs, settlers, beneficiaries, protector, and many others; location of the business, location of major operations or assets, origin or current location of the source of funds. It is therefore clear that country of incorporation is not the sole factor in assessing the geography risk. Banks and TCSPs should ensure a comprehensive assessment is done for all other pillars of risk assessment, that is, customer, product and services, and delivery channels. The FATF guidance for TCSPs issued in June 2019 contains 27 factors in assessing customer, which is one of the pillars of a risk assessment. We do not expect banks and TCSPs to have a long list of factors for each pillar, because most of the factors can be combined or some of the factors are not applicable. However, we expect banks and TCSPs to demonstrate that the risk assessment is comprehensive and covers all relevant risk factors depending on the nature and the operations of the bank or the TCSP. In this example of a skewed risk assessment, we have an extract of a risk assessment where the entity in question considered the 4 pillars of risk assessment: geography, customer profile, products and services, and delivery channel. Geography, customer profile, and products and services were all assigned a high risk score of 3. Delivery channel was assigned a score of 1 because this was a face-to-face interaction with the customer. The total score was 10 and the average score was 2.5. Using either the total score or the average score resulted in an overall risk rate of medium. And the overall risk rate is dependent on the score legend, which is on the right side of the screen. So the first score legend, which is based on total score, the total score of 10 would lie between 8 and 11, and hence the medium risk rate. The second score legend, based on average score, our average score of 2.5 is medium. You can see from this example that the score legend is skewed, which led to a medium risk, whereas high risk was the most appropriate risk assessment for this customer. Therefore, banks and TCSPs should ensure that the parameters used in risk assessment are assessed to ensure that they are not skewed, which would lead to overestimation or underestimation of the risk. Let us now discuss thematic deficiencies pertaining to monitoring. The first common deficiency is failure to include a comparison of estimated and actual customer activity. Understanding the trend of the customer activity and comparing that trend with the estimated activity provides key insights to the customer operations and AML, CFT, and PF risks. Banks and TCSPs should ensure that as part of their monitoring, they are able to compare the estimated activity and the actual customer activity for any unusual or unexpected changes in the customer activity. Another common deficiency is monitoring parameters which are not reflective of the actual client activity. For instance, we have noted cases where transaction monitoring systems are set to flag or to raise alerts for customers who exceed, let's say, 30 transactions in a month. However, when we review the bank's actual customer activity, we note that there is no customer who's ever exceeded 15 transactions in a month. Clearly, the threshold of 30 is not reflective of the actual client activity. It was noted that this was as a result of use of off-the-shelf applications without modifying the parameters in those applications to suit the nature and complexity of the entity's operations. Some of the off-the-shelf applications are designed for big multinational corporations, and therefore banks and TCSPs should ensure that such applications are customized, the parameters are reassessed to ensure they are consistent with the bank's operations. Another common deficiency is failure to implement monitoring measures for high-risk customers. The AML guidance notes requires banks and TCSPs to ensure that high-risk customers are monitored frequently and more closely. Therefore, to achieve this, banks should have monitoring measures specific to high-risk customers. Another common deficiency is transaction monitoring frequency that is not driven by client risk rate. Banks and TCSPs should ensure that their transaction monitoring measures are driven by the client risk rate, consistent with a risk-based approach. This means high-risk customers will be reviewed more closely. Another common deficiency is transaction monitoring alerts which do not consider all relevant risk factors. For instance, transaction monitoring alerts which do not include measures to monitor activities conducted by politically exposed persons. Another common deficiency is lack of adequate or timely closure of transaction monitoring alerts. For instance, we've seen cases where transaction monitoring alerts are closed without adequate documentation why those alerts were closed. Other instances are long outstanding transaction monitoring alerts. For instance, transaction monitoring alerts that remain open for over 3 months. We expect banks and TCSPs to implement procedures and measures pertaining to the closure of transaction monitoring alerts. We do realize that at times, transaction monitoring alerts would not be closed within the specified timelines. However, we expect banks and TCSPs to put in place a procedure for this exception, which includes approval and monitoring of the overdue alerts. Another common deficiency is outdated monitoring parameters. For instance, parameters set over 5 years ago may not be applicable today. Therefore, banks must ensure that the parameters remain relevant. Another common deficiency is a failure to monitor changes in customer risk factors and risk profile. Banks and TCSPs are required to monitor changes in customer profile and customer risk factors to ensure that it remains relevant and accurate. Another common deficiency is a failure to complete periodic review of business relationships. The AML rules and the AML guidance notes requires banks and TCSPs to complete a periodic review of business relationships to ensure that any changes in the customer risk profile are documented and updated. Another common deficiency is periodic review of business relationship not driven by the risk assessment. A risk-based approach requires banks and TCSPs to ensure that periodic review of business relationships is driven by the customer risk assessment. This means high-risk customers will be reviewed more frequently compared to low-risk customers. The only exception to this is when there is significant change in customer profile, such as negative news. In such instances, banks and TCSPs should update the customer profile even if it's not due for periodic review. Another common deficiency is a lack of adequate documentation of policies and procedures supporting the monitoring procedures. Now that we have discussed the common deficiencies in a risk-based approach, let's now discuss the best practices which will help you in designing and implementing a robust risk-based approach. The first best practice is to ensure that all elements of a risk-based approach are adequately documented and supported by board-approved policies and procedures. Another common best practice is to ensure independent assessment of a risk-based approach is conducted by the internal audit or any other independent unit. Another best practice is to conduct periodic review and adjustment of the risk-based approach and the parameters to ensure they remain relevant. This does not mean that banks and TCSPs would be expected to carry out a comprehensive review of the entire risk-based approach on an annual basis. However, banks and TCSPs are expected to review the risk-based methodology whenever there is evidence that the parameters are either outdated or they need to be reassessed. Another best practice is regular training to staff members on the application of the risk-based approach. Another common best practice is documentation at client file level of the review and monitoring practices that have been performed by the bank or TCSP. This will enable any reviewer to assess the review and monitoring measures conducted on the particular customer. Another best practice is for banks and TCSPs to ensure the single highest risk score drives the overall risk rate of the customer. Otherwise, there should be a documentation why that is not the case. Let's now look at the key references with respect to the risk-based approach. The primary references are the anti-money laundering regulations, proceeds of crime law, the guidance notes on the prevention and detection of money laundering and terrorist financing. All these primary references are available on the authority's website. The AML guidance notes also include sector-specific guidance for banks and TCSPs, which provide further details for banks and TCSPs. International best practices are the FATF guidance for risk-based approach for the banking sector and the FATF guidance for risk-based approach for TCSPs. If you have any question on this session, please contact the Banking Supervision Division by sending an email to contactbanking@cima.ky. You can also contact the Fiduciary Services Division by sending an email to contactfiduciary@cima.ky.